All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining this breakout session on New Start and the future of the U.S.-Russian nuclear arms control regime. My name is Shannon Bugos, and I am a research assistant at the Arms Control Association. I am very excited to be welcoming Rose Gottemoeller for this discussion today. We only have 25 minutes and a lot of ground to cover, so let's get started. Rose was the Deputy Secretary General of NATO from October 2016 to October 2019. Previously, she had served nearly 5 years as the Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security. She has also served as Assistant Secretary of State for Arms Control Verification and Compliance, and she was the Chief U.S. Negotiator of the 2010 New Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, known as New START. She's joining us today in a personal capacity representing her own views. During this discussion, we will dive into what's ahead for New START and possible futures for U.S.-Russian nuclear arms control beyond New START. After I briefly set the scene, we will open the floor to your questions. So feel free to start sending us those questions through the Q&A function in Zoom, and I will get to those in just a few minutes. But first, I want to provide some brief background for where things currently stand with New START. So New START is the last remaining treaty limiting the US and Russian nuclear arsenals, and it will expire on February 5th, 2021, which is now just over 2 months away. However, the treaty text allows for an extension of up to 5 years, so long as both US and Russian presidents agree to it. In October, we saw dueling proposals from the Trump administration and Moscow concerning the treaty's extension. The Trump administration proposed a 1-year extension of New START with a 1-year freeze on all US and Russian nuclear warheads, plus some type of verification on that freeze. Russia agreed to the 1-year extension and to the idea of a 1-year warhead freeze, but rejected any type of verification at the time. Ultimately, no deal was reached prior to the presidential election, despite claims from some Trump administration officials that such a deal was agreed upon at the highest levels. And since the election, Moscow has said that it would wait until the dust settles before commenting further on the fate of the treaty. President-elect Biden has said that he supports an extension of New START, and one of his top advisors, now his nominee to be Secretary of State Tony Blinken, recently suggested that Biden would pursue a full 5-year extension. However, that does not seem to be quite set in stone, according to some reports that we saw last week. Biden will have just 16 days between inauguration and New START's expiration. So now we'll turn to Rose, and again, we are welcoming questions from the audience. You can submit those questions through the Q&A function in Zoom. So as those continue to roll in, it looks like, I will ask the first question. So Rose, over to you. I want to ask for your take on what Biden's move should be upon taking office on January 20th. I'm going to bundle a few questions here together, but I think they're all related. So should Biden seek a full 5-year extension of New START or an extension for a shorter period of time? Would a less than 5-year extension, say 1 or 2 years, provide leverage with Russia, as some have claimed? Furthermore, what do you think Biden should do with the warhead freeze concept he stands to inherit from the Trump administration? Should a New START extension be held hostage to that idea of a warhead freeze? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Shannon. It's great to be here with everybody. Thank you all for joining us today. My long-held view has been that New START should be extended for the full 5 years permitted by the treaty for a very simple reason. That is, we are embarked on a triad modernization, a modernization of our nuclear force structure. And it's important that we maintain and sustain predictability and stability over the period in the next decade when we will be on the, setting the priority on the modernization of our arsenal. So I think there's a good reason to do so for national security reasons, and I would just go with that. Now, the notion of a 1 or 2 year extension has been out there, and of course that was the Trump administration position. I always thought it was impractical to achieve a new treaty in 1 year. Perhaps you could do it in 2 years, but even with New START, which was a very quick negotiation, it took a full year to negotiate the treaty and another 10 months to get it through the ratification process on Capitol Hill to get Senate advice and consent. So 1 year is too short. 2 years maybe, but this idea that it somehow gives leverage, I laugh about it because the Russians are expert negotiators. Of course, two can play these games, but I think we would just waste a lot of time trading leverage at the negotiating table over this matter of, who's gonna go next on wanting to make the next move on extending the treaty. And I don't think it's worth it. Frankly, I think the U.S. national security interests are predominant here. Finally, on the idea of a freeze, to me, this is an important principle. Some of you may be surprised that I would say this, but this is an important principle that the Trump team established and got Putin to agree to, that we should embark on direct limits on warheads. Now, a freeze is inadequate. We all know a freeze is inadequate. And even with the Trump team, they were saying we have to move on now quickly and get to monitoring and verification. So that is more like a formalization of a freeze into a limitation that one would verify. I think that's really where we need to set our sights now and focus on that as the next goal. Sure, put in place a freeze at the outset, that's fine, but move quickly to turn it into a verifiable limit.
So we have a few questions on what it looks like Russia's stance will be. So prior to October, Moscow had proposed a 5-year extension of New START with no preconditions. And as I just mentioned a few minutes ago, they had come up with a new proposal in October in response to the Trump administration's proposal. So what do you think Russia will put on the table before or come January 20th when Biden enters office? Will they go back to their proposal earlier about a clean 5-year extension? Or are they going to, I think, as someone had asked, like sweep up the glass and see kind of what's going to happen with the proposals that we saw in October and the idea of the freeze?
Well, the signals that I'm seeing out of Moscow are that they would be willing, as they've said, to proceed with a full 5-year extension of New START without preconditions. So in my view, once again, that's in U.S. national security interest. We should just pocket that and not mess around with anything less. That is the signal I'm seeing. And if there are other signals out there, maybe our viewers can comment on that further.
So now shifting to China, we've gotten a few questions about how we can involve China in arms control. So let's see, conversation had already started under the Trump administration about ways to potentially get China involved in arms control. They mainly focused on 2 lines of argument, it seemed like, that international pressure was going to force China to come to the table. And then there was the argument that if China wants to be seen as a great power, then it must act like one by coming and joining the discussions. Russia, meanwhile, on its side, had said that if the US wants to include China, then that means the UK and France should also come to the table. So do you view the Trump administration's efforts to try and pull China into arms control as the most effective means to really convince Beijing, who's been really resistant to the idea, to actually come and join the talks? Or do you think that there's a better way? And overall, how would you advise going about the way of multilateralizing arms control, which we've heard about?
Yeah, this is, again, people might be surprised to hear me say it, but this is the second principle that the Trump team put on the table, got established, which I really welcome. It is high time, I think, that China be ready to consider limiting its own nuclear arsenal in negotiation with others, placing some controls and constraints on it. Not because I don't agree with the notion of trying to shoehorn them into New START. The United States and Russia still have over 90% of the nuclear weapons in the world, and we still have nuclear arsenals, strategic nuclear arsenals that are much, much bigger than China's. So the notion of shoehorning them into New START never made any sense. But to begin to draw China to the table, and particularly to draw them to the table to put constraints in areas where there is some equality on the Chinese side, I think that's really an area that we should look into. As I said in my Washington Quarterly article from September, the notion of placing limits on intermediate range ground-launched missiles in Eurasia involving the Chinese, the Russians, the United States, that's an area we should really look into, because unlike in the era of the INF Treaty, when we had to ban all such missiles, we now know enough about monitoring the presence or absence of warheads on the front ends of missiles. We do that in New START, in reentry vehicle on-site inspection. There's no reason why we couldn't engage the Chinese on a limit. rather than forcing them to ban all of their INF range systems, which of course they're going to object to. But they may have an interest in such a negotiation because I'm sure they want to prevent the deployment of US GLICMs in Asia, and they probably have concerns about the Russians too, who are putting their new 9M729, their new GLICM in the far east of the Russian Federation. So I think, there could be an interest there on the Chinese side, and we could engage them. But we have to look for areas where there is some equality with the Chinese in order to actually draw them into a negotiation. Now, discussing with them other matters, such as it's in their interest in the future to constrain their strategic nuclear arsenal and have them engage in those discussions, I think that's entirely necessary. We need to get into a serious strategic stability discussion with the Chinese as well as with the Russians.
You had mentioned the INF Treaty, so I want to turn to a question from the audience that asks, should we write off the INF Treaty entirely, or should we try to revive some of its limits in some type of form in the future?
Well, you could hear from my preceding answer that I think we're far beyond the INF Treaty now, frankly, in the sophistication of our ability to monitor and verify the front ends of missiles. So we should really be looking now for a new treaty or a new agreement that focuses in on perhaps a limit on the number of nuclear-armed intermediate range ground launch systems, or perhaps bans them. It is quite possible, in my view, that there could be an interest, have to be explored in both Moscow and Beijing, in perhaps a regional ban on nuclear-armed intermediate-range missiles that are ground-launched. I don't know the answer to that question, but I think we should be exploring some new directions, and we should bear in mind that, frankly, we're beyond the approach that was taken in the INF Treaty, which was simply to ban all such missiles, whether nuclear or conventional.
So, especially given your previous post as Deputy Secretary General of NATO, we've gotten a few questions from folks about what US allies and partners, including NATO, should do to try and convince the United States to extend New START, to extend New START and continue their support for starting talks on a follow-on arms control treaty after New START. So how might the United States best engage its allies and partners in arms control more generally as well?
I think my experience as Deputy Secretary General of NATO is that the allies are becoming increasingly focused and interested in contributing in very positive ways to further nuclear arms control activities. And frankly, I was very pleased about that, because earlier on, when I was in my undersecretary role with my US hat on, I found oftentimes that they were kind of, oh, that's for Moscow and Washington to be concerned about. But I very much welcome that the allies today are much more engaged and involved, and really willing, I think, to look at how they could help in the future. So I do think we need to take advantage of that. There have been good consultations in recent years with the allies, and it did a lot in terms of bringing the allies to all assess that the Russians are in violation of the INF Treaty with the new 9M729 missile. The allies independently were able to reach those conclusions because of very good consultation between Brussels and Washington. And so I think those kinds of consultations need to continue, but now we need to think ahead. For example, if we are going to approach the notion of a new kind of INF agreement or treaty, then we'll need the allies to help to look at how such an agreement might be monitored or verified. We also have the resolution of ratification of New START still hanging over us, but anyway, it's valuable, I think, as I said, that we now have this approach that we will start to limit warheads directly. So that means also the allies may have to be involved in monitoring and verifying warhead restrictions that involve European territory. So all of these are fruitful areas for cooperation with the allies, and I think the cooperation will grow on fertile ground now, as it would not have even 6-7 years ago. So NATO's in a different place. An interesting question is the Asian allies as well. How about ROK in Japan? How are they going to relate to working with the United States in these areas? I think there will be some enthusiasm there, but again, it will have to be nurtured and developed.
So now turning to some questions we've gotten about what a follow-on treaty to New START might look like and the roadblocks that it may come across when trying to negotiate. So the Trump administration for over a year talked about wanting a new arms control deal that includes China and covers non-strategic nuclear weapons and new Russian strategic nuclear delivery systems. Russia has spoken about the importance of addressing US missile defense, advanced conventional strike weapons, and non-strategic nuclear weapons deployed in Europe, as well as including the UK and France, as we talked about earlier. So one of the questions that we've gotten is, what is the best way to ensure that unconstrained strategic missile defense does not block reductions in strategic offensive forces? And then we've also gotten a question about what are the top concerns that should be addressed in the follow-on treaty, and what type of concerns do you think will get pushed maybe later on down the line, maybe as part of something that comes even after that?
Mm-hmm. Okay, very good. A very complex set of questions. Let me do my best here. Again, as I think we're beyond the INF Treaty in some ways, and we can go for something bigger and better. I think we are also, in a way, beyond just the notion of constraining non-strategic nuclear warheads. This total ban on, or total freeze rather, on warheads that the Trump administration proposed falls into line then with a kind of total limit on warheads. I think many would say that it doesn't make much sense to distinguish between strategic and non-strategic warheads, because in the case of the Russians, you know, those warheads get used on whatever kind of delivery vehicle. And so looking at a total limit on warhead numbers, whether strategic or non-strategic, is definitely an area we should be looking at, we should be studying and preparing for. Again, the fact that this was a total warhead freeze that they were talking about, I thought was a good kind of principle to establish. So we can move now in that direction of looking at all warheads in a future limitation. Again, direct limitation of warheads, a new area, one that has been kind of the holy grail for many years. We've wanted to directly constrain warheads, but the monitoring and verification has always been very, very difficult because of the sensitive nature of those warhead facilities. So we'll have to work hard to figure out exactly how we are going to do it. But I do think that that will be a priority going forward. It has to be a priority going forward. Now on the offense-defense relationship, as always, that is very, very delicate and very much of concern to the Russian Federation. They do recognize the political constraints that the United States is under because of the lack of any desire in any part of our political system, whether it's on Capitol Hill or in the executive branch, to place direct limitations on missile defense in the way the ABM Treaty limited missile defenses. So we will have to look for other ways to work this problem. I've heard the Russians say in recent time that they're ready to look at political as well as legal ways to address this issue of the offense-defense relationship, the missile defense relationship, with the possibility that if it becomes unlimited, it would undermine their strategic offensive deterrent forces. This is still very much front and center among their concerns. But the notion of looking at some political measures and not so much worrying about legally binding measures, but I think this is an area that we should also be exploring because there are pretty stark concerns I can see being raised now as to the nature of the US missile defense program. The notion that it is a limited missile defense is still very much US policy, but some doubts have been raised about that in recent years. And so there will have to be some hard work, I think, done to talk about this issue once again with the Russians. And not only with the Russians, it's going to be a matter of concern for the Chinese too going forward, but in their case, they've long been concerned about the theater missile defense forces that are represented by the THAAD deployment in South Korea, for example. So lots of issues out there, not only for the Russians, but we also hear about it from the Chinese as well.
So I want to go back a little bit when we were talking about US allies and partners. We've gotten a few more questions about whether the P5 process could be used as we start talking about multilateralizing arms control. And then as well, what is the relationship with New START and NPT review conference next year? So the RevCon is later next year, and someone had asked whether New START will be really important for, an extension of New START will be important for the NPT RevCon. And I think that's later next year is when it's the next tentative dates for when it's going to happen.
Right. Well, let me start with that. I do think that extension of New START for a full 5 years would lend some positive momentum in preparations for the NPT review conference. So I think that's a very good reason to proceed with that full 5-year extension. In addition to which, I argue in this Washington Quarterly article that we should look at a quick new reduction of the type that was the Moscow Treaty. A quick new reduction in operationally deployed warheads. On the table from the Obama administration was the so-called Berlin proposal for an up to 1/3 further reduction of operationally deployed warheads, would take the level down from 1,550 under New START to approximately 1,000. So I think that's a proposal worth looking at. Of course, a lot depends on the shape the Senate is in after the Georgia votes in early January, but getting the 2/3 necessary to ratify such a further reduction would be a difficult step to take. So I do think that we might also consider some smaller measures, and the easiest one would be to take note of the fact that both the United States and Russia are already below the 1,550 number in terms of operationally deployed warheads. This was in the declaration from September, the New START data exchange. So, a simple step would be to acknowledge that the numbers are lower as a kind of parallel unilateral measure. So that would be one way to go, or even take the numbers lower again in a parallel unilateral measure. So I think there are a number of approaches and ideas to think about. Again, I want to stress what you said at the outset, Shannon. I'm voicing my own personal opinions here. I'm not privy to any, official or other discussions. This is my private opinion.
So when you were talking about reductions, I want to touch on this question that we received, that President Obama once put forward the idea to downsize the New START level from 1,550 to 1,000 or to 1,000 warheads. What is your personal view? Will Biden repeat the same offer to Russia?
As I said, I think it's a good proposal. It was on the table starting in 2013. It's ironic that at that point, the Russians wouldn't talk about a further reduction. They said, we're going to wait till the New START central limits are reached in 2018, and then we'll be willing perhaps to negotiate a further reduction. So they weren't willing to play at that point. So I think it's obviously something that at the time the Joint Chiefs of Staff were willing to sign up to and agree to. And of course, it would have to be reviewed and considered again. But I think basically it is within the realm of possibility.
Sure. So we're getting to the end of our time here. So I just want to end on a final question about verification. So we've seen from the Trump administration that it's made no secret its view that the New START verification regime has deficiencies, such as the length of time it takes for inspectors to arrive on location and the frequency of inspections. You had written earlier this year in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists that, quote, in the end, the United States got what it wanted in the New START verification regime, streamlined inspection procedures at a sufficient level of detail to be effectively implemented, end quote. So as the Biden administration enters office in January and as talks hopefully get underway on a follow-on treaty, what would you highlight as the pieces from the New START verification regime that should carry over? And are there other parts that you would recommend adjusting for the future, especially in light of, we got a few questions about emerging technology, so start to cover pieces like that.
Yes, well, the bottom line argument in that Bulletin of Atomic Scientists article is that verification measures have to be appropriate to the obligations of a particular treaty. They cannot reflect the obligations of past treaties, they have to be very specific to the obligations that are embedded in a given treaty. And the verification measures for New START were entirely crafted in order to implement those obligations. So I think that going forward and looking at the next treaty, I would say we've gotten some really good experience in New START with reentry vehicle on-site inspection. I've noted that again and again as being the door that is opening now to a more sophisticated approach to limiting intermediate range ground-launched systems. So I really believe that that notion of being able to distinguish the declared nuclear objects on the front of a delivery vehicle from the conventional objects that are there, that really opens the door for a lot of possibilities in the future. And so I think that's one of the very promising areas. But, you know, it's not rocket science. What we've done over the years in terms of on-site inspection has been very carefully crafted with a number of very now well-established procedures about how to do a proper on-site inspection. And so that, I think, a lot of that will be able to carry forward, but it will have to be then structured and crafted again to match the obligations, whatever obligations are in a new treaty. And if we begin to limit warheads directly in a new treaty, then there will have to be some very difficult, complicated, and sophisticated warhead monitoring measures. Already the Trump administration was talking about PPCM, perimeter portal continuous monitoring at warhead production sites. You know, is that really the way we want to go, or do we want to consider instead some kind of PPCM at storage sites? That might not be something that the US would like to do. So all of these things will, of course, have to be hashed out carefully first on the blue side among the US interagency, the interested parties, and then we'll have to see what the Russians think, what they can countenance.
Thank you so much, Rose, for joining us today, and thank you for everyone who tuned in. So as you can see in the Zoom chat, we have links to the next 3 breakout sessions. So if you just click on the respective link to the session you want to join, you will pop on over there. So thank you again, Rose, for joining us and for sharing your insights.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody, and thanks, Shannon.
Thank you. Have a good rest of the day, everyone.